to you, Jim. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Kerry, and thank you, the recording lady. Yeah, I'm delighted to be able to talk to the WallCAP group, and I think some of the Redesdale people as well, I hope. And it brings together work I did in the past and some continuing work I'm involved with. And it's an opportunity also to give some publicity to a sort of parallel HLF project in Redesdale, but I'll come on to that in a little while. So out with the wall. Well, being a professor in Edinburgh, I've learned a little bit of Scots, and of course it doesn't mean out with the wall, it just means beyond the wall. And so beyond the wall, Romans in Redesdale, and it's really the Romans in North and Northeast Northumberland. I'm really talking about the lines of two roads. You can see it on the slide now. On the left, the line of Dere Street. I'm sure it's familiar to almost all of you, the A68, one of the finest roads I always feel in Britain. It runs up from the Tyne Valley, Corbridge, and then up past Rochester, and then into the Middle Tweed Basin. And I'll also be saying something not so much because we know less, and the period that it was occupied and actively used by the Romans was much shorter. I'll also be saying something about the more eastern route, which goes up towards Tweedmouth, so the mouth of the Tweed. Although, as we'll see, it doesn't actually cross. We're pretty sure it doesn't cross into Berwick itself, and that's been known as the Devil's Causeway. And both Dere Street and the Devil's Causeway were documented in detail by McLaughlin in the middle of the 19th century. Now, when we think about Roman occupation, then I sort of slightly apologize in that I'll be taking a very Roman perspective today, but I will say a little bit about the other side. If we think about Roman occupation, it's a bit like a barometer. And if you think of the line of the barometer as being Dere Street, it goes up and then it comes down, and it drops upwards and forwards. So in the 80s and 90s, it had got as far as into Toothville into Perthshire, and the occupation, the most furtherly occupation of Roman Scotland after Agricola's successful campaigns. But then, of course, it quite quickly retreated backwards, bound towards the Middle Tweed Basin around Newstead, and then eventually, by the time of Trajan, around about 100 AD, back towards the Tyne Valley. And that's the period of which we recognize as the Stengate. Now, why is it not moving? No, it's not moving. All right, try that one. That's it. Okay. You always have to find which of the methods you're going to start using or not. So, first of all, I'll talk about Dere Street. So it runs up from Corbridge, the great crossing of the. Remember that the Romans, although there are some who argue that the A1 was used by the Romans, there's very little evidence. Well, in fact, there's no evidence, no immediate evidence, that the line of the A1 running across the Tyne at Newcastle and then northwards was ever a significant Roman route. It could have been a route, but it hasn't left traces. So let's go back to Dere Street, and that's the major route that comes up from York, goes through County Durham, and then comes into the Tyne Valley at Corbridge, and then rises up from the Tyne Valley onto the line which was to be later taken by the wall, and then proceeds northwards, and Corbridge, Newstead, and then runs on up towards, heads towards Inveresk, which is near Musselburgh, or just above Musselburgh, but running up towards Cramond on the Firth of Forth. Now, basically, we're concerned with two great river catchments. The one is the Tyne, and particularly the North Tyne, because the Redesdale, is a tributary of the North Tyne, and then up into the Middle Tweed towards Newstead and around Melrose and Kelso. So that's the sort of the area that we're really concerned with. It's a busy road, certainly in terms of Roman antiquities. I'll come on to talk about the numbers of inscriptions, but in terms of earthworks and physical remains, it's one of the great routes within the Roman Empire. and perhaps the greatest of all the sites. Certainly from when I first came to study at Newcastle long ago, I was taken out to see up into Redesdale, and we were taken to see the site of Chew Green. Chew Green lies on the northern fringes of the Ottoman Ranges on the southern flanks of the Cheviots. And in the right light, it's a really mind-blowing site, because you can see the presence of Rome. You can see camp after camp, one overlying the next, two large temporary camps, an earthwork fort and a fortlet, and the lines of trackways, but not the passage just in Roman times, but in times before and certainly times afterwards. So this was a great crossing point. It was before you went over the Cheviots and dropped down into the basin of the Tweed. So I won't say much more about Chew Green, but Chew Green is one of the great sites, as I say. And Rudyard Kipling wrote about this, and he called this country that big, it's not, my screen's covered in, I can't see it very well, that big purple country of broken stone. And it's not just earthworks, although we shall be seeing some recent representations of the earthworks of Dere Street, but it's also stones. Not so much from Chew Green, but from the two major forts at Risingham and High Rochester, there is a really quite spectacular collection of stones. This one, these two rather uncomfortable ladies, or three uncomfortable ladies, Venus and her two nymphs, is from High Rochester, but is in the Great North Museum, the former Museum of Antiquities. And you see stones, if you look for them, all over. If you take the A68 North and you just pass the sign which says Rochester Village and the little sign that says to High Rochester, you'll pass what was the old schoolhouse. And then beside the schoolhouse is a porch. If you look at that porch carefully, it's got some odd shaped stones built into it. It was actually constructed after, we can be fairly certain of this, it was constructed after 1855, because these are stones that were discovered in the course of two phases, two seasons of excavations, first of all in 1852 and then in 1855, partly sponsored by the Duke of Northumberland and also by the Society of Antiquities of Newcastle. Now, these stones, there's a pier base there, which would come from a line of barracks. I remember finding similar ones from Housteads. There's a window head, a clear window. This is a stone window head. I will just get my laser pointer out. A great window head you can see there. The next one, these two great stone balls on either end of the pediment. And they're generally thought to be ballista balls, and similar balls have been found elsewhere. And the plot gets more interesting. And down here, we have water channels and all sorts of, you could spend ages going through this wall and the two other walls of the small porch and identify so many of the buildings within the fort just further up the hill. But there are also stones that speak to us because they've got writing on them. Now, if you actually go carefully around the Great North Museum and you look, it's always, museum curators aren't very good at telling you where things come from these days, but if you look carefully where the stones come from, you'll see that a significant number of the stones, which represent a major collection relating to Hadrian's Wall, actually come from Redesdale. They come from either Risingham, which is the more southerly of the outpost forts, or High Rochester, which we've just been considering. Now, this is a major inscription. It's a reconstruction. And I'll show you another text, which is again a reconstruction. It was reconstructed by Sir Ian Richmond, who was professor at Newcastle. He wrote what was the most important work about Roman Redesdale, which was the Romans in Redesdale in volume 15 of the Northumberland County History. Now, this total inscription was originally 18 feet 9 inches in length. It used to be in the old Museum of Antiquities, and it was easy to say. Now it's got all these other things crowded around it. But this is actually what was discovered in the in the 1840s, and this is a drawing of the fragments of that inscription. And this is another inscription, but this time from High Rochester, which has essentially the same sort of formula, imperial formula. But what I think is interesting about it, although it's not unique, these inscriptions from Risingham and High Rochester are very large in size. They belong to the period after the death of Septimius Severus, when his son Caracalla was ruling with Septimius's widow, Julia Domna. So it dates to 213 AD. And it tells us essentially the emperor and the emperor's predecessors. You know, it's a sort of claim to succession, if you like, because it goes all the way back to Trajan and Hadrian and so forth. Well, it also tells us here on the very northern fringes of the Roman world are those conquests of the emperors, Arabicus, Adiabanicus, Parthicus. And in fact, the next slide, I put all the names of the places which are recorded on those inscriptions around the fringes of the Roman Empire. The conqueror of Britannia, well, that's Severus's campaigns in northern Britain into Caledonia, against the Germans in Germania, against the Sarmatians beyond Asia into what is now the Ukraine, into Adiabini, that's northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, basically Kurdistan. Parthia, these were the great enemies in the east. And Severus, as Trajan had before him, had defeated the Parthians and extended the empire much further than before, although, you know, inevitably it shrunk back. And Arabia, that was a province originally founded by Trajan, but then extended even further under Severus. So these are the sort of conquests. So if you were a native leader who might, by the 3rd century, have begun to pick up a little bit of Latin to get by, you'd be presented by one of these great statements of bombast and power in these outpost forts, well north of Hadrian's Wall. And on the left, I show you the frontispiece of Richmond's Romans in Redesdale, where this is discussed. So, first of all, I'm going to talk about, that was Risingham, which we were discussing just now. High Rochester is there, and Blakehope is there. These are all sites I'll be considering over the next few minutes. So this is High Rochester. This is a photograph by Tim Gates, and you can see very clearly the outline of the fort. There's, as we shall see, further examples of rig and furrow, but also it has a very sophisticated and deep set ditches on all 4 sides, although they're not so well preserved to the west. They're well preserved to the south and particularly to the north. And from our surveys and excavations in the 90s, we were able to demonstrate the system of multiple dishes extends also to the east. Now, on the right, I show you the plan from the 1855 excavation. There are a number of reproductions of this, all slightly different. But it shows what is almost the complete plan of the interior of a really very exciting, because it's actually probably the first time this has ever been achieved anywhere in the Roman Empire. You know, lots of other places like Housteads or the Saalburg in Germany or Birrens in south of Western Scotland get the credit, but actually it's High Rochester. Now the form of the fort is basically conventional. It's a bit smaller than Housteads, although as we shall see, the garrisons and excavations in the 1850s, and then Richmond went back and excavated in the mid-1930s in preparation for his long chapter in the Northumberland County history. And then when I was at Newcastle teaching, we excavated between 1992 and 1996 on behalf of the Northumberland National Park and English Heritage, basically the organization which is now Historic England. And at that time, we carried out geophysical surveys, we carried out small-scale excavations, and we also carried out a detailed survey. So we created what's called a digital terrain model based on total station survey. And the plan of the geophysics here is essentially based on the plan of the barracks in the northwestern corner is based on geophysics, but the plans that you can see there is basically the 1855 plan integrated with the 1990s survey. But there's a new project, Roman Redesdale, revitalizing Redesdale. And I have enormous thanks to Paul Frodgen, who was involved in the project, Karen Collins, who's currently the coordinator, and Ed Hudspeth, who carried out the created the LiDAR image, or helped create the LiDAR, many of the LiDAR images. Because as part of this Heritage Lottery funded project, they've been undertaking the analysis, the identification and analysis of LiDAR. The LiDAR images they're freely accessible through the Environment Agency in England. And this is just the first one that I'll show you, some of many. And if you just Google revitalizing Redesdale, you'll get an access. There's a PDF which Paul Frodgen put together last year, which gives you a whole range of these images. And I do recommend this because it's a really important contribution. Now, the Redesdale folk have not been only interested in the Romans. Actually, up until almost now, they've been more interested in what we sometimes call the natives, or the British population. People who lived in the hills, the people who lived in the farmsteads, and just very close to High Rochester on the other side of the A68 as the farmstead at Burdup down here, and also down here at Wool-Law, very typical. And a few years ago, about 20 years ago, there was a reconstruction, which I'm sure many of you passed, called Bremenium, which has now been allowed to fall into ruin. But that was a reconstruction of one of these farmsteads. But I'm basically going to talk about the Romans in the time I've got available. But there's a whole serious, major potential discussion, and there are a number of new projects. My colleagues in Edinburgh have just got a fairly large grant from the Leverhulme Trust, and they'll be looking at specifically the regions between the Antonine Wall in the north and Hadrian's Wall to the south. And one of their case study areas is Redesdale, running from Otterburn all the way up towards Melrose. So this is the first of these LiDAR images. And this shows, I think, one of the sites which tends to get ignored. It doesn't, when most of the textbooks talking about Redesdale, they'll talk about Risingham and High Rochester, but they won't mention this site. It's called Blackup. It's just next to the A68, and it's immediately to the west of Otterburn. And there we have a temporary camp, and within this enclosure, we have a fort, and immediately to the south of the fort, underneath the farm buildings of Blackup, there is clear signs of an annex. And of course, there's other features such as later Ring and Furrow, and the line of, well, the Roman road we assume is running underneath, more or less underneath the modern road. And here is the line of the River Reed. Remember, this is not in their photograph. This is a LiDAR image. So it's actually similar to the image I showed you before, which was created through using total stations, but this is using airborne laser scanners in order to create the data, which can then be transformed through various GIS and other techniques into the images that we can see here. Now, the more to the south of Blackup is the major fort of Risingham, and I've already talked about that huge inscription from Risingham. And Risingham is preserved, certainly from the air, as a remarkable site. It's less easy, it's on private land, and it's less accessible than High Rochester, which can be, it's a public space, High Rochester, certainly within the area of the fort, not the fields outside it. And there are formal paths around it. But that's not the case with Risingham. But you can see Risingham, particularly in the winter, as you come down towards West Woodburn, heading southwards when the leaves aren't on the trees. It's very close to the River Reed, which you can see here. And the River Reed has clearly cut into it and has dug away part of the fort, although the river is now further over to the west. It's a standard shape. It has multiple ditches. There's good evidence for ploughing. And most of the structures which you can see, or the indications of structures which you can see here, actually belong to a medieval village which existed on the site. But there were excavations in the 1840s, just as there were slightly later the next decade at High Rochester. And these excavations discovered some of the epigraphic stones that I've showed you before, but more importantly, they showed the south gate. There's nothing else like it in the north, certainly not north of York. It is simply the most imposing piece of Roman fortification anywhere north of York. It's a huge projecting multi-angular gate, 2 towers, multi-faced, a later gate, 2 major phases. This is Richmond's redrawing of them in 1935, and he gave the dates of Severan, Constantinian, and then post-Constantinian. But there's clearly, from what he could see, looking at the 19th century evidence, that's what was represented. And this is the inscription that was above that gate. And it's one of these bombastic texts with the figure of Mars and Victoria she's standing on a football leg, on the right-hand side. Now, this is as I say, there's nothing else like it in the Roman north. And it represents a form of fortification which has become, absolutely dominant outside of northern Britain and across the rest of the Roman Empire in terms of military sites. This is the only instance that we have from, certainly to date, from Britain, until we get to the Saxon shore forts later in the 3rd and the early 4th century, around the southeastern and the southern shore of England. So let's turn ourselves to High Rochester, which is much of the discussion will be concerned with that. Here you can see a LiDAR image, and there you can see the fort. You can also see the landscape the fort is. There's a stills burn, and then you can also see traces of other earthwork features. And when I was talking about Chew Green, I mentioned the importance of the numbers of earthwork features. These are very largely deriving from temporary camps and whole sequences of temporary camps. It's like watching the sort of fossilized footprints of elephants marching across these northern fells. So this is the Burdock camp. So we can see one camp there, and then the second camp, better preserved, in the middle there. So this is just 2, and then there are other camps further to the north and other camps further to the south. There's a whole sequence of camps, and these have been studied and are well known and published. But it's an important sequence indicating the passage of armies through generations of periods of Roman control. Now, we saw the 1990s representation of the fort. This is how we see it in LiDAR, and I'll show a more detailed image of it in a little while. In terms of the physical remains of High Rochester, which I'm sure many of you will know, there are good stone walls, nothing as grand as was found at Rrisons, but is now covered up. But here you can actually see at the west gate, again, a very substantially constructed gate, much more so than, say, some of the gates on the wall forts like Houston's or Bed Oswald, with sort of really detailed moulding. And this is one of the interval towers. The fronts of the interval towers were all taken in the early 19th century to build the mounts at Rochester Village. I understand that's now up for sale. We should take it down and rebuild the fort. And within the interior, we were able to carry out limited excavations, really just to sort of test how the veracity and the reliability of the 19th century plan. It's all well and good sort of rubber matching the 19th century plan onto a 20th century digital terrain model, but does it fit? Surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, it does. Because we found the features which we could recognize of the plan, and they were pretty much where they ought to be. So, in other words, we could be fairly confident. And this is just to demonstrate how close the Roman remains, or the very top of the Roman remains, are to the ground surface of Rochester. Here, this is the end of the Bassel House, where Beryl Charlson lives, and she wanted to create an extension. And so we carried out a small-scale excavation, identified the Roman remains, and then the extension was constructed on top of them, didn't dig into them. But it does give you some indication of the shallow depth of the Roman deposits. And Richard Carlton has been carrying out, and Alan Rushworth, they carried out a number of small-scale excavations on the site, and they found much the same results. Now, the area around High Rochester, once again, we have very good evidence of rig and furrow. Sometimes it's the narrow rig, and sometimes it's broader rig, which is probably of late medieval day. You can see this nice sweeps on the rig here, and traces of it there, and traces of it here, something we could never see. It shows up in the LiDAR, but it never showed up either in the geophysics or in air photography before that. So this is the basic sort of setting of High Rochester. We have a Roman road, Dere Street, running on the east side. Another Roman road running to the east, across the fells towards Holystone, and then towards Learchild. And that links up with the Devil's Causeway. I'll come on to that shortly. But let's think about High Rochester and what the LiDAR tells us, and also what the geophysical survey and limited excavation told us from the 90s. One of the features that's most intriguing and hopefully will be investigated as part of a project in July by the Revitalizing Redesdale group, who are going to be carrying out, just as WallCAP has been carrying out excavations, successful excavations, I understand, Cambeck. So the Redesdale group will be carrying out excavations with students, with some students from Newcastle University, directed by Richard Carlton, in this area down here, and possibly in this field over there. Now, one of the questions, one of the reasons we were asked to initiate an investigation at High Rochester in the 1990s by the National Park and the Northumberland County archaeologists was to test whether there was evidence for a vicus, civil settlement, outside of the fort. Now, this is just this is from the English Heritage website on Hadrian's Wall, which has some really excellent reconstructions. This is slightly formalized, the vicus. It doesn't actually reflect what's known from photography, but it looks like more like a trailer park. But at the same time, what you can see here is the fort. Remember, Chester's was a large cavalry fort. The crossing of the River Tyne, the wall, Balham, etc. But more importantly, this significant civil settlement around the southern side of the fort, in the bathhouse there. Now, was this the same situation that we were going to find if we investigated outside of the fort, in those forts north of the wall, the outpost forts north of the wall? So this is a geophysical survey, and there was 3 or 4 years of geophysical survey carried out by GeoQuest and Dr. Martin Knoll, and what was able to demonstrate that there was a clear evidence for an annex on the west side of the fort. And this tied in very well with what Ian Richmond had found in the 1930s. We were also able to see traces of the barracks, a different configuration of the barracks to the ones that survived from the 1855 plan. And I think the reason for that is that this area has been cultivated much more than the rest of the interior of the fort. So they've effectively taken off the later levels in order to be able to cultivate it. But still, it demonstrates, so it's earlier phases of the barracks, that phase. And then to the east, we can see the line of Dere Street. And there, very clearly, the line of the Roman road running up towards Holystone and Learchild. But what we didn't see, and we carried out small excavations, and we opened areas, we didn't see any clear traces of a vicus, of the sort that Alan Biggins was able to demonstrate very clearly from so many of the forts along the wall, from Alton Chester's, from Bird Oswald, and most impressively from Maryport. So none of those, the vici, the civil settlements, which were apparent through geophysical survey, whether it was magnetometer or resistivity like this one, simply wasn't there. So there's the annex, and that's the annex that I was just talking about. The other feature out here shows up more clearly in terms of the magnetometer. I'll show that in a minute. But this is just the traces of the turf rampart of that annex. And interestingly enough, it has a stone footings, and this is the turf bank. So the turfs are there. And then the turfs themselves, this is the ditch on this is the south side. There's the fort wall. So this is the ditch, and it seemed to be filled with turfs which had been demolished from that rampart. Enough, in other words, as if it had been pushed over. And I suggest there that it might be 1st century, but hopefully further investigations this summer might actually be able to give us a clear idea of the chronology. This slide here shows you more clearly how nothing apparently is emerging apart from the lines of roads and a certain amount of a sort of busyness, but nothing as clear as we find from High Rochester, from the wall sites. High Rochester doesn't just have a well-preserved fort. It has almost the sort of the full picture. You know, it's got cemeteries. And one of these cemeteries, at Petty Knowes, was excavated by Beryl Charlton in the 1980s and was published in Archaeologia Aliana. It was a barrow cemetery, and there are also tombs, stone tombs. There are 2 stone tombs. Only one really survives now. One was rectangular, and this one was circular tomb, probably with a great mound on it, and a number of carvings around it also. These survive on the southeastern side of the fort, along the line of the Roman road, exactly the place where you'd expect tombs to be. Now, the interior of the fort, however, was much more crowded than somewhere like Houstead's or Chester's that we've already seen. There were more buildings than you would expect. There were 2 sets of granaries. There's one granary there and another granary there, flanking the headquarters building. And the commanding officer's house presumably is there. There was a bathhouse. The bathhouse is down here in the southwestern corner. And interestingly enough, from the excavations at Risingham, there was a bathhouse internally. In other words, there's no immediate evidence for an external bathhouse. So I return to High Rochester and try and think about what sort of site it was. I'll just say something now about what's happening further to the east, the eastern part of Northumberland, beyond, in the valleys of the catchments of the Coquet, and then up towards Tweedmouth, the line of the Devil's Causeway. Now, the line of the road that links the two near Holystone was excavated by the Holystone group. Again, it's I've lost the title. You can see, I hope you can see it at the top. And this was kindly sent to me by Richard Carlton, who excavated. But it is a spectacularly well-preserved example of a Roman road. You can see the drawing on the left and a vertical photograph, which preserves, this is almost textbook. It has a spine down the middle. So that's a really impressive example of a road. And so that was the Roman road linking, that's roundabout there. Now, what I've done here is to take this topographical map, which shows the line of these 2 roads, Dere Street and the Devil's Causeway, and I've put on a series of sort of earthwork forts and also temporary camps. So the temporary camps are the grey diamonds, and the black diamonds and the black square that's the fort at Leertracht. So there's a small fortlet not far from on the line just there, not far from Morpeth, above the Wansbeck, which is preserved in a wood and was published by Humphrey Welfare a few years ago. It's not actually on the line of the road, but it's manifestly a Roman in its form. So it represents something of a question mark. But there are also marching camps, one there and one there, another one there, and another one midway between High Rochester and Leertracht. And then at Wupperton, excavations about 15 years ago, which have never fully been published, but an evaluation of the ceramics was able to demonstrate there was a really significant quantity of Roman pottery, mostly dating to around about 100 AD, but no significant structures. So there seems to be something there, but Wupperton is a quarry, so the site's gone now, or the site that was excavated is gone now. But the finds from it do deserve fuller discussion. And as we get closer to the mouth of the Tweed, there's another marching camp at East Horton, and I'll show a slide of that in the next slide. So this is the East Horton, and here you can see the line, the curve, and these were published by Tim Gates in an article in Archaeologia Aliana. a few years ago. So this is near to Doddington Moor, as the Devil's Causeway sort of comes out across into the plain to the south of Tweedmouth. But then there are also known from air photography a sequence of marching camps to the west of Tweedmouth, and this is now around Norham, Carham, south of Kelso, and towards near Newstead Tremontium itself. These are all located on the south side of the River Tweed, which is why I don't think there's anything Roman on the Berwick side. Needle's Eye is the site of an excavated Romano-British settlement. But these are the these are signs of marching camps. So there's quite clearly a Roman route up the Tweed, although there's no evidence for a Roman road. A Roman route, presumably from the mouth of the Tweed and the line of the Tweed Valley, which is a gentle valley running up towards Kelso and Melrose, is a good route for moving armies and moving troops and communications and supplies up towards the great centre at Newstead. So who lived in these forts at Risingham and High Rochester? I haven't really got time to go into this in any detail, but I have mentioned to you the rich epigraphic record. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Roman inscriptions in Britain, which is now online, RIB. And if you go in and look at RIB for either Risingham or High Rochester, you'll see how many inscriptions, how many stones there are. Some of them are the sort of standard, sort of bombastic building inscriptions of the sort I've shown you. Others are altars. Others, there are some tombstones. This is an intriguing stone, which relates to these chaps, these large round balls on the end of the porch to the schoolhouse. And this, within the fort at High Rochester, there is something called a balistar, which is a ballistarium. And it's thought to be a place for the storage of ballista, in other words, Roman artillery. This is heavy artillery. Richmond suggested there were platforms along the ramparts so that the Romans could lob these stone balls at charging natives. I'm not sure many people accept that anymore. They may well have simply been places for storing ballista so that they could be used. And this is, of course, a point about these outpost forts. So it could be used to take on campaign against the tribes. These forts are about small wars as much as anything else. They're not about big imperial campaigns, although presumably some of the marching camps do represent those great campaigns which went northwards, you know, whether it was under Severus or whether later on it was under Constantius Chlorus and his son Constantine when they were campaigning against the Picts. But no, I think these were places to conduct small wars in order to maintain a sort of the obedience of the local tribes. You could either do it by force or you could do it by bribery. And the Romans used both techniques, we know. The garrisons at Bremenium, at High Rochester, the Lingones cohortes equitata. Interestingly enough, always the garrisons are mixed infantry and cavalry. They're sort of flexible, not single cavalry like we find at Chester's, but flexible units. Then we find the Varduli, who were Roman citizens, and they were 1,000 strong in the time of Caracalla. We also have these units which are exploratores. We know other exploratores. These are scouts, the Bremenian scouts, the High Rochester scouts. So once again, you see something within these garrisons and forms of the garrisons about who was here and what their function might have been. There were also vexellations from the legions, the northern legions, the 20th and the 6th. And further on, we find the Varduli. There's an altar, which is now in Jedburgh Abbey, dedicated to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, which probably comes from Caput, which is the fort on the other side, the northern side of the Cheviot. And there's also, this is associated with another group, which are not sort of the regular men. These are the Rhytian spearmen. So lots of different sorts of soldiers. Some of them are the soldiers of the regular units within the auxiliaries of the Roman world. Some represent the vexellations from legions, and others represent some of the slightly irregulars just the sort of troops you'd need in a frontier zone outside of the formal barrier of Hadrian's Wall. But some of the inscriptions, again, you can see you can find these either in the Great North Museum or in the collection at Alnwick Castle. There's one or two elsewhere, but there's two major places. Excuse me. This is dedicated Deum Victo Soli, and this suggests that there may well have been a Mithraeum at High Rochester, but where it was located, we don't know. And there are tombstones with a tombstone representing the tribune, the foster child of a tribune. So ranges, and this in some ways is the most intriguing because it's the people who it mentions. It's not as well carved as the other stones that I've been showing you. I've obviously deliberately taken those stones easy sort of to recognize what they are. But this one is now to be seen in Elston Church. I visited it last summer, propped up against the wall. That's the stone there on the right. This is as represented by Collingwood Bruce, and it brings out the writing. But what's important is it's dedicated to a man called Rufinus, who was a tribune of the garrison, who had formerly been subcurata of the Flaminian Way in Italy. In other words, he was a man who looked after he was a motorway service manager. You know, he looked after the infrastructure of the great routes of the Roman world. But actually what's interesting is it was put up by his wife, who was called Julia Lucilla. And after her name, she put CF. It's the same as putting ons after your name. She was clarissima femina. She was of senatorial rank. So where Rufinus would have been of the equestrian order, she'd married down. She survived him. She got somebody to put this long inscription, which recorded that he was a man who looked after the roads, the infrastructure, the way that the empire worked. So it's a story of stones. And I've already shown you this one because in some ways, although it was terribly criticized by R.G. Collingwood as being, sort of inept, basically, and ugly. But it's a very classical image. And it's a very classical image. And the carver was trying to represent a scene which would have been familiar across the Roman world. So we have sculptures as well as inscriptions. What happened to these forts? These forts out with Hadrian's Wall. The coin evidence is not, in my view, has been argued that the coin evidence found from the excavations in the 19th century suggests that the fort was abandoned after the time of Constantine, in the early 4th century. I don't think the number of coins are sufficient to be able to be confident of that. The ceramic evidence that we discovered when this was studied, remember that's from excavations outside of the fort, suggested that there was very little after about 300. So there's no obvious sort of late Roman forms. However, I think there's evidence to suggest refurbishment in the later period. And this is here, which you can see in this photograph, and here up in this corner where they're using very large stones, some of which have indications they're sort of patching up the wall in much the same way that they were patching up the walls of housteads in the middle of the 4th century. So I'm not convinced that the forts were abandoned after the time of Constantine. I think they may have been maintained as outposts, maybe not at the full strength. But I want to move in towards the very end of my talk and just say something about a more recent piece of research, which Catherine Murphy was involved with. In fact, it's basically her research when she was doing a dissertation for a master's MSc in Edinburgh, and I worked with her. We went up to Ruber's Law. So we've crossed the line of the Cheviots, and we're just over, Ruber's Law is here, Cappock is there, High Rochester is down here, and Newstead is there. And this is the Cheviot Ridge. So this is a very prominent hill fort, which you can see there on the north side of the Cheviot Ridge. It's apart from the Eildons, which are the hills above Newstead itself and above Melrose. It's one of the most prominent hills in the Scottish border. It's interesting about Rubersdale. It clearly has a number of phases, but from investigations at the very beginning of the 20th century, some of the stones that were identified there were clearly seen not to be local, but had been brought in, and that is what attracted my attention to do further study. And I was able to persuade Catherine, who's seen here on, I don't know, it wasn't the middle of winter, but it turned out to be a lot snowier than it was in Edinburgh, I must say. And we went up this hill to look at it, and then we returned with a departmental drone to take a whole series of images. And this isn't a snowy view of Rubersdale. This is similar to a LiDAR view, but this is created from a sequence of photographs, which are then, you use photogrammetric software in order to create a digital terrain model, and the image you can see there. So here you can see the ramparts of the hillfort, the inner citadel, and this is a characteristic of a number of the hillforts. It's also characteristic in Northumberland, as well as in the Scottish borders. So you can see very clearly and there are shielings and other structures in this area here. But what intrigued us particularly were these stones, because the hill itself is a volcanic plug, whereas these are sandstones. And many of them are quite clearly worked in much the same, I'll show you another slide, are clearly worked in precisely the way that the Roman stones from somewhere like High Rochester and similar stone forts would be. Amongst the stones in the Hoyt Museum, and I managed to get to the Hoyt Museum just before the first lockdown, I managed to persuade them to find them. There are these stones with broaching on them, which are very characteristic Roman. So we have basic Roman building stones and a number of 2 or 3 other stones, which are quite distinctive. Now the distribution, there's the citadel, which I showed you in the previous slide, with what seems to be traces of cord rig in the middle there, but that's coming up from the photogrammetric image. And this is the distribution of the stones. In other words, these stones had been reused as part of the ramparts for citadel. Now, if they're Roman in date, it means there is a later refortification of this hill fort, probably sometime after the 2nd century, probably the 3rd or 4th century AD. Of course, we've not carried out any further excavations there, but you can see very interesting the concentration of these stones. And this was achieved through basically integrating the terrain model created from the drone image, and then using GPS in order to identify the individual stones. And so this is more of the stones from the Hoyt Museum. And here you can see the squared stones, particularly those with tapered backs, which are characteristic of Roman construction. The problem is, what sort of building do they come from? In the past, it's often been suggested that this is a signal station. Whereas whilst Rubersdale is in a very good place to be a signal station, and this is what Catherine was able to demonstrate in the first article that she published, I was named as well, that she published on this. And she was looking at the potential of this place as being an observation place, and also what it could see, and also the potential for signaling. However, I'm not convinced of that. I think there was something else there. I'm not sure I'm prepared to go public and say what it was. And Catherine and I are still trying to prepare an article which will actually argue the case more, I hope, more convincingly. But there's something like perhaps a shrine or a stone structure. Remember, there are very few stone structures in Roman Scotland. Once you get over the Cheviots, whereas To the south of the Cheviots in Redesdale, you've seen the stone forts, you've seen the epigraphy. Once you get into the borders, Scottish borders, there's very little in the way of stone, although there are more stone structures than you might imagine. Kipling in Park of Pook's Hill has this quotation. It's slightly, I'm slightly misusing it because he's talking about approaching the wall from the south, but it fits much better to the lands to the north of the wall. In the naked hills beyond the naked houses, where the shadows of clouds play like cavalry charging, you see puffs of black smoke from the mines. The hard road goes on, and the wind sings through your helmet plume. Past altars of the legions and generals forgotten, broken statues of gods and heroes, and thousands of graves where the mountain foxes and hares peep at you. Red hot in the summer and freezing in winter is that big purple heather country, broken stone. I hope I've been able to demonstrate that we need to say more about the country beyond the wall. On the right, I show you Cacidius at South Yarder, overlooking the line of the Roman road, which runs from High Rochester to Learchild, the Roman road we saw the traces of. I'm glad to be able to say that I've already mentioned that there will be, hopefully, excavations in July and further geophysical survey carried out by the Revitalising Redesdale project under the direction of Richard Carlton. There is also new attention. There's a PhD currently near completion at York, and a new project by my colleague, Manuel Fernandez-Gertz, who is current head of archaeology in Edinburgh, a Leverhulme funded project with Historic Environment Scotland, is looking at the country between the Antonine Wall to the north and Hadrian's Wall to the south. And as I've mentioned earlier, Redesdale and to the north out into the Middle Tweed Basin is part of the area. And they're specifically looking at those, what we might call native sites, the non-Roman military sites within those zones, both in the late Iron Age and into the Roman Iron Age period. And a further work will be carried out by another one of my colleagues from Edinburgh, Ben Russell, who has a project called the Earthen Empire, which is looking at the use of turf and mud brick as a construction material in the northwestern provinces. And he's been doing lots of really interesting analysis of turfs from Vindlanda and from Carlisle. And hopefully in the course of the excavations in July, he'll be able to look at those turfs, which I showed you a little earlier. So although what I was talking about was a project, a slightly distant project from the late 1990s, I'm actually delighted to be able to say that there's going to be more attention towards High Rochester. And as part of a variety of projects, in the next few years, we're going to have a much greater coordinated understanding of what happens and the interaction between natives and Romans in this particular zone. Thank you for your attention.